Hey there, Margie Bryce here, bringing you the Crabby Pastor podcast. And I don't think you're going to be too surprised to know that it's too easy today to become the Crabby Pastor. Our time together will give you food for thought to help you be the ministry leader fully surrendered to God's purposes and living into whatever it takes to get you there and keep you there. So we're talking about sustainability in ministry. I am here for episode number 2 with Janyne McConnaughey. She is the author of Trauma in the Pews, The Impact on Faith and Spiritual Practices. And this was a book that was written to help ministry leaders, pastors understand trauma, because that is a major piece of what the people in the pews are living with, dealing with. So Janyne, start us off like this. COVID. Talk briefly about the trauma of COVID.
COVID. I don't know about, and thank you for having me on this podcast. I'm so appreciative of this and getting my message out that I believe brings compassion to our ministry. And COVID, it was a worldwide collective trauma. And there wasn't, sometimes when trauma is experienced, you have a segment of the pot, for instance, there's a flood in an area and people from other areas who didn't experience a flood could go and help the people who experienced the flood. But there wasn't anyone who wasn't impacted at different levels. I'm not saying that the impact was the same on everyone. It's certainly, my impact was certainly not the same as other people, but it was collective and it was help. And one of the hallmarks of trauma is feeling helpless and powerless. And if there's anything that in my lifetime that collectively has made the world feel helpless and powerless, it was probably the pandemic.
Sure. And, in our last episode, we talked a lot about the ACE, that's ACE, and it is what does that stand for again? Remind me.
Adverse childhood experiences.
Okay. So now we're talking about trauma in an adult life. And so can we shift for just a second and talk about the kinds of trauma potentially that ministry leaders experienced?
I think that every ministry leader who is listening to this podcast would say, ministry has had a lot of traumatic moments in it. And I think that we have to look at that trauma is an ongoing impact of an event that happened. And so in ministry, for instance, if and this is how our bodies work. This is just normal, what our bodies do to take care of us. But if you are leaving church one Sunday and you have a church member take apart your sermon in the parking lot, okay, which I grew up in a pastor's home, I don't.
You can say that,
right? Yeah. And then the next week you're kind of hesitant to go out in the parking lot and talk to people. Okay. That's a trauma response. Okay. That is exactly because your body was created to keep you from going back to situations that felt unsafe. And so anything that happens to you in ministry without the processing of that and the, working through, I talked about in the last podcast, the fact that why did that person, what was going on inside of that person that they felt it was necessary to come to you and do that. Right. And I've been yelled at in parking lots more than one time. So I know, I know that feeling. So mostly by students who didn't understand their grade, but anyway.
Yeah. That's another podcast.
But yeah, that's another whole nother podcast. But if anything has happened to you in ministry that was difficult, then that lives on. It just doesn't end with that moment. It is part of your story that continues to impact you. And if you experienced adversity in childhood, the likelihood that you will be impacted by something that happens to you as an adult is much greater.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And then you
yeah.
talk in the book about the high cost of not doing your own healing.
Yes. So there's a type of therapy. It's called internal family systems. And one of the things that I love about that type of therapy is it talks about that we have wounded parts inside of us. And when anybody comes near those wounded parts that have not been processed, have not been healed, have not been helped, then we have protectors in our structure of our being that jump forward and try to defend us or try to fight back or try to and so whenever we are in ministry and we have not resolved what took place in our childhoods, then that wounded child is always sitting there and we feel protective. And so what happens is that when somebody says something to us that connects to something that happened to us, either as an adult or at a younger age, then our nervous system becomes dysregulated. So one of the I had someone I was talking with you gave the illustration.
Was it me?
Yeah, it was. We were talking last week. You gave the illustration of you can't have a tug of war if someone sets a rope down. If one side sets a rope down, you cannot have a tug of war.
Yeah, right.
It's a beautiful picture of you can't have a fight if someone, and I'm not talking about not having a voice, but I'm talking about if one person can remain regulated, then the argument will not begin to escalate. And you see this everywhere. And the most difficult, the people who find it most difficult to self-regulate are those who have young trauma, attachment wounds, abandonment issues, trauma experiences. It's you, instead of learning to self-regulate as a child, you learn to survive, and you feel protective instead of being able to say, what is happening right here is not about me. What is happening is about what is going on inside of this other person and why they feel the need. And so to be able to remain regulated, to remain calm yourself, requires you to do your own work.
Right. But because ministry leaders are trained to do the non-anxious presence thing. But that doesn't mean that there's not something brewing underneath that needs to maybe be explored so that you can go on and be an effective ministry leader. And we talked some in the last podcast about pray more, read your Bible more. But as you said in the book, and I like this little segment, it said, not everything is a spiritual issue. And that's, when you are the dispensers of the spiritual solutions to life, it's very difficult to hear that maybe there's other things that need to be explored for healing to come. Just like, I just spoke at an event the other day and I said, high cholesterol is not exactly a spiritual issue. A broken arm is not exactly a spiritual issue if they just happen by accident. And maybe you're not the kind of person that makes your cholesterol high. Some people's bodies do that, but so you're going to go to the doctor for help. You're going to go to the ER for help. And that's okay. And certainly you want people to pray over you that healing will happen well and thoroughly and all those kinds of things. That's absolutely amazing and wonderful. But when you're talking about childhood trauma, again, you need to seek potentially some therapy. And I want to take one thing from your book that you said, because I think there's a lot of ministry leaders that will resonate with this. And I think this is a bit of a paraphrase, but mostly what you said. When the honeymoon is over That's the first, year
Yes.
maybe of your arrival at a new pastorate. When the honeymoon is over, treading water becomes harder, and many who enter ministry never experience the joy of swimming.
Yes. Yes. As you read that, I can feel myself sitting in the chair in my office in the home we no longer live in, and realizing that so many of those like myself who appeared to have it all together, who appeared to be compassionate, which I was, and I was skilled at my job. I was great, but as far as knowing how to regulate my emotions and how to so much of internal stuff, I was like I was thrown into the deep water without any swimming lessons.
Yes, yes, you have some swimming analogies in here.
Yeah.
You also said living as an adult who missed developmental steps or building blocks to your emotionality as a child. I'm adding a bit here. Feels like being thrown into the water without swimming lessons.
Yes. And so I'm doing everything by control. If I get into a situation and and I and I know that whatever this person is saying to me is not creating a good feeling inside of me, which I want to avoid at all costs. I don't know what to do with that. The church doesn't teach us anything about neuroscience, about our bodies, about the vagus nerve and how it runs all through our body and communicates back and forth between our brain and our body, and what that is, what the hormones and stress chemicals are going on in our body, so that we can befriend it and be like, oh, I get it. Now I can do some deep breathing. We just don't know how to do any of that. So when instead we try to control. And when I think about control, it's kind of like when you're at a swimming pool and you have a beach ball and you hold it under the water,
Mm-hmm.
and after a while you get tired because it's pushing against you and you let go of it. And what did it do? It just explodes out of the water. And that's what happens when we control ourselves. I did a blog once on the fruits of the spirit through control, and what a mistake it is to try to control ourselves. Instead, we need to go in and heal what's causing all of that turmoil that makes that ball want to bounce up out of the air with anger or all sorts of trauma responses.
So here's a question then.
Yeah.
People who enter ministry and never experience the joy of swimming. And I think about ministry leaders that have departed the ministry because they just say, this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't,
Right.
You need a strong personal resiliency. You need self-awareness. There's a lot of things you need as a ministry leader that really is not included in some of the seminaries that train. And you even advocate for some child development understanding. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I've not heard that anywhere.
Right. Because there's so much that we attribute to the sin nature in children that is actually just developmentally appropriate stuff. And so we're shamed for that as children, when in reality we just I'm thinking of my friend's book again, and Cultivating Kids, and I think that he does a great job of the child development piece, because
I'll have to get that from you and put it in the show notes.
Yeah, and put it in. I will.
Yeah.
It goes into a lot of the biblical precepts that have been misinterpreted and caused a lot of really bad parenting strategies. So it does a great job. So anyway, but I think that unless we do our own work and we consider the building blocks that maybe we did not receive as a child, and then it impacts how we relate to other people. It's really, really easy to get triggered by and if someone is manipulative, to react against it instead of realizing, oh, they have an unmet need that their behavior is demonstrating, and getting underneath and finding out. But if we aren't secure in ourselves, that's really hard to do.
It is. And here's what you say in your book. Leaders who do not take time and effort to heal will end up in situations where they are helping others while still in the desert without enough water. They both become too dehydrated to survive. That's probably the nicest explanation of when when stuff explodes at church.
Yes. Right. Because you need someone who, and so I took the whole month of September off, and I'm just emerging back out, because I realized that sentence in my book, that I was trying to help people and I was dehydrated, and that I needed to step back and figure out what was dehydrating me, make some changes in my life, do some things differently, so that I would not. And what was it in particular in this last year? It was because so many people came to me with their religious trauma and told me their stories, and it was triggering my own story, and I wasn't taking enough time to process that and to reflect on it, and so forth. So yes, and it's not a once and done thing, right? Oh, I'm completely self-aware, and now I can, because there'll always be a new situation that will be like, oh my gosh, I need to go spend some time and work on that.
So you've brought up, a lot of people that have been interested in your book are trauma victims, right?
Yes.
Even though the book was written to help ministry leaders understand the trauma in the lives of the people that they're called to serve.
Right. And that was so, because I was kind of sad, because mainly I like to talk to survivors. I like to help survivors. And I'm like, oh, I've devoted an entire year to writing a book but when it published, that's who went and bought it. The people who were suffering and were sitting in the pews and I don't know, I can't even estimate how many emails, messages, that I received that said, thank you. I feel so seen. I feel so validated. And people would say, I bought one of these books for every one of the ministry leaders at my church, because I want them to understand me. And so, and that to me was the highest compliment, that I had not only said what the ministry leaders needed to hear, but that I hadn't talked about the survivor in ways that they would not feel seen and validated. And that was my greatest fear, was that, because a lot of times, you read a book and they're talking about the client or the parishioner or the congregant, and they're talking about them. And I didn't want that to be the case. I didn't want the people who have survived horrible things in their life to feel talked about instead of seen. And so I'm very grateful that they felt seen. I felt like I accomplished what I set out to do.
So what, you say in the book that you're sending the wounded out to care for the wounded. These are ministry leaders out to care for the wounded, without ever acknowledging that the underlying problems require more than salvation. And actually, you and I talked earlier about some of these woundings and traumas are what draws people into leadership, because you want to help others.
You want to help others. And here's the really interesting thing about that, is that for the most part, people who come to the church and are helped and they heal, and I'm not saying that healing can't ever happen in a church, but when that happens, it's because of the relationships. Okay. It isn't about the preaching. It isn't about did you disciple them correctly? It isn't about any of that. It is about the relationships, that they finally felt seen and cared about and heard, and that. And what they actually go into ministry to do is to take that forward, It isn't, but when they go to the ministry preparation colleges, they teach them how to preach and how to lead a church and how to do the business, how to run a board meeting, how to do all of those things. And there's, maybe a class or two on pastoral counseling or something, right? But it does not get the reason that they go into ministry. So I was a teacher educator, and for the most part, there's two types of teachers. Some of them just love the subject, and they usually end out at high school because they want to just teach the subject, right? But then most elementary teachers want to go because they remember a teacher that they had that cared about them, and they want to go and do the same thing again, right? So then they come and we teach them how to write a lesson plan and do right? It's the same thing, right? And so what the trauma movement is doing is to say you as a teacher are the most important part of this child's success, not because of what you teach them, but because of how you understand their trauma, understand trauma deeply, and have a relationship with them that helps them to build resilience. And so the same thing is true in the church. We've trained for the wrong. We figure, well, they came because they're compassionate and that's all they need. But they needed to understand why the compassion of their experience helped them heal.
Right. And there is a book that I will put also in the show notes about overcoming the dark side of leadership. And that book basically says the same kind of thing, that it is our very woundedness that draws us in. I mean, that's Henry now, and you want to be the wounded healer, but you got to remember, you got to take care of your own woundedness as well. You got to put your mask on. If the oxygen masks drop, you got to put yours on first before you help someone else. That's a pretty basic thing that we all understand. But what would you say to ministry leaders if they suspect, maybe they'll go online and take this ACE test, I don't know, and discover, or maybe they've already kind of wondered, why do I react and respond in these ways when, it really doesn't make sense. Your amygdala is firing. And so the thinking department just goes to sleep while you are doing your fight or flight thing. And you don't really understand. What would you tell ministry leaders they should be pursuing?
Well, I say in the book that I think that therapy helps everyone. The trauma in the Pews would not exist without my intense therapy journey and a deep look inside of myself to figure out why I did what I did, what I was responsible for, what I wasn't responsible for, why control didn't always work, why I could control myself, but I didn't feel joy, why joy was almost inaccessible to me, except in moments and glimmers and sparks of joy, and that I should have been experiencing on the regular. And I think that we all have to realize that there is no shame in having had difficult experiences in our lives. I say at one point in the book that we shouldn't have to leave our stories in the car when we go into church. And for the most part, that is especially true of ministry leaders. Because we had this, I don't know why, but we had this idea that ministry leaders were supposed to be the ones who salvation had made some kind of perfection, that we had all the answers, and in reality I posted a meme on a page last night, and it said we're all a mess helping each other make it through the best we can. Right. And I think that if we viewed ourselves in the church like that, instead of setting people on pedestals like they have all the answers, like I post stuff on my Facebook page every once in a while because I don't want people to put me on a pedestal, because it's a consistent, constant effort to apply what I know, and in ways that keep me regulated and that fill my well, so I'm not trying to help other people from an empty well. So I think that that's what I would say, is go get help. There's no shame in asking for help. And I need to say, okay,
Mhm.
You, if you're listening to this podcast, you basically have all the spiritual answers. Like,
Mhm.
you sit in your offices and you tell people the verses, the spiritual answers. And probably one of the best, I've had several therapists, and one of the best therapists for me was the one who said, I have no problem with helping you and with you being a person of faith, but I'm not a person of faith. And asked me the best questions, the very, like, why are you doing this? Well, and I would give a church answer. Well, because I'm serving God. You know what I mean? Like, oh my
Mhm.
gosh, that falls flat for you, doesn't it? Why am I doing this? No, I need to go deeper than I just want to serve God, right? I need to go deeper than that. So sometimes you need to go to someone who isn't going to just echo. You're not going to sit in an echo chamber together. They will ask you the questions that are not spiritual. And so anyway,
I
because
know. And I remember preaching a sermon, and there was a psychological component in there, and a couple of people sort of tagged me at the end and said, "Wow, you are doing psychology." And I was like, "Well, when is why we do what we do not important?" And
right.
trying to understand that. And the gospel can definitely shed light on that for us. But I think there's something to be said for figuring out why we do what
Yeah,
we do.
why did Paul was trying to figure it out. Why do I not do what I want to do? And I do, he had lots of trauma in his life, so I won't go there, but it is important to understand why we do what we do. And here's the thing is that we have taken psychology and historically in the church, we made it the enemy of faith. And in reality, the understanding of trauma and the healing of trauma and faith and spirituality should be able to walk hand in hand
Mm-hmm.
right down the middle of our lives.
Oh, for
We
sure, for sure. And
shouldn't be separated.
I've dabbled some in family systems theory, and scripture says the sins of one generation are visited on the next. And so I always thought about that in a compounding way. And I would always say, well, gee, Lord, how bad are you going to let it get down here? But I would just kind of, look at that. But there's many times as you are studying these things that the scripture comes to life for you in a different way.
Right. I think that we forget that as we, for instance, okay, the world is, well, there's some people who still believe the world is flat, but we're pretty sure that the world is not flat. But there were people burned at the stake because they said that the world was not flat. Okay. And so there's always fear when new ideas come. And I think that it is important to realize that when the Bible was written, we did not understand how the brain and body work.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there is so much of where it was how the body works was observed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That we can look at and say, oh, now that makes even more, like the one you're talking about.
Yeah, it
The
sheds light,
It
sheds more
sheds
light.
light on what those observations were before we understood and had the knowledge that we have now.
Right.
And so,
Absolutely.
yeah, so we should see it as a way to illuminate what has been over the ages a constant. I mean, the themes in the Bible are constant, and they all, if you view it from a trauma lens, you just see trauma and ineffective parental relationships. You just see it everywhere, right?
Yep. People are
And
people still.
people are people, and trauma affects them the same then as it does now, except now that we have more information about how that works and how we can help people, we can use it to enhance our understanding. It doesn't mean that we're taking away from it.
Absolutely. We don't want to do that. Don't want to take away. Well, I want to thank you again for being on the podcast and this trauma. This is a fairly new area for me to delve into, but it's been very fascinating, and I was just very intrigued by your book. But I will say this one last thing real quickly here, Janyne, and I should have warned you about this. So here, that's my apology. But because this is the Crabby Pastor podcast, I always ask anybody I interview, what makes you crabby? So this is your moment. I mean, I don't know, maybe the stain on the carpet makes you crabby today. I don't know, but
Well,
I
it's kind
like
of funny. It's kind of funny because when I told my husband I'm going to be on the Crabby Pastor, he goes, "Oh, that is a great title for a podcast. That is awesome." Okay, so I wasn't expecting the question, but what makes me crabby? Probably the quickest thing to send me on a rant is when someone who has experienced the very worst that life could hand them and has a beautiful faith somehow, and when they get judged.
oh,
Okay, that makes me really crabby, because I think, oh, you are missing so much. You are viewing this from a kind of a legalistic standpoint where they're not doing it the way that you want them to do it, when in reality their faith is remarkable and beautiful, and God is meeting them exactly where they are. And so probably the thing that makes me crabby is when people get judged who are survivors. Yeah.
well, thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation we've had, and look in the show notes. I'm going to put that ACE in there because there's things on that list that, just about everybody I know is taking part in one of those at least. And
Right.
And we'll put other information in there as we need. But thank you again, Janyne. I really appreciate you being here with me.
Thank you for having me. I've loved this conversation.
Hey friends, the Crabby Pastor podcast is sponsored by Bryce Art Glass, and you can find that on Facebook. I make stained glass. That's part of my self-care. And also by Bryce Coaching, where I coach ministry leaders and business leaders. And so the funds that I generate from coaching and from making stained glass is what is supporting this podcast. And I will have opportunities for you to be a part of sponsoring me. And as always, you can do the buy me a cup of coffee thing in the show notes. But I will have some other ways that you can be a part of getting the word out about the importance of healthy self-care for ministry leaders. Hey, thanks for listening. It is my deep desire and passion to champion issues of sustainability in ministry and for your life. So I'm here to help. I stepped back from pastoral ministry, and I feel called to help ministry leaders create and cultivate sustainability in their lives so that they can go the distance with God and whatever plans that God has for you. I would love to help. I would consider it an honor. And in all things, make sure you connect to these sustainability practices, so that you don't become the crabby pastor.